The Leavenworth Case, A Lawyer's Story, by Anna Katharine Green, Part 7, Book 3. Hannah, 27, Amy Belden. A merrier man within the limits of becoming mirth. I never spent an hour's talk with her, loves, labours lost. I had a client him of the name of Monell, and it was from him I had planned to learn the best way of approaching Mrs. Belden. When, therefore, I was so fortunate as to meet him, almost on my arrival, driving on the long road behind his famous trotter Alfred, I regarded the encounter as a most auspicious beginning of a very doubtful enterprise. "Well, and how goes the day?" was his exclamation as, the first greetings past, we drove rapidly into town. "Your part in it goes pretty smoothly," I returned, and thinking I could never hope to win his attention to my own affairs till I had satisfied him in regard to his, I told him all I could concerning the lawsuit then pending, a subject so prolific of question and answer, that we had driven twice round the town before he remembered he had a letter to post. As it was an important one, admitting of no delay, we hasted at once to the post office, where he went in, leaving me outside to watch the rather meagre stream of goers and comers who at that time of day make the post office of a country town their place of rendezvous. Among these, for some reason, I especially noted one middle-aged woman. Why, I cannot say. Her appearance was anything but remarkable. And yet, when she came out, with two letters in her hand, one in a large and one in a small envelope, and meeting my eye hastily drew them under her shawl, I found myself wondering what was in her letters, and who she could be, that the casual glance of a stranger should unconsciously move her to an action so suspicious. But Mr. Monell's reappearance at the same moment diverted my attention, and in the interest of the conversation that followed, I soon forgot both the woman and her letters. For determined that he should have no opportunity to revert to that endless topic, a law case, I exclaimed with the first crack of the whip, "There, I knew there was something I wanted to ask you. It is this. Are you acquainted with anyone in this town by the name of Belden? There is a widow Belden in town. I don't know of any other. Is her first name Amy?" "Wes, Mrs. Amy Belden." "That is the one," said I. "Who is she? What is she, and what is the extent of your acquaintance with her?" "Well," said he, "I cannot conceive why you should be interested in such an antiquated piece of commonplace goodness as she is. But seeing you ask, I have no objection to telling you that she is the very respectable relict of a deceased cabinet-maker of this town, that she lives in a little house down the street there, and that if you have any forlorn old tramp to be lodged overnight, or any destitute family of little ones to be looked after, she is the one to go to. As to knowing her, I know her as I do a dozen other members of our church there up over the hill. When I see her I speak to her, and that is all. A respectable widow, you say? Any family? No, lives alone. Has a little income, I believe, must have, to put the money on the plate she always does, but spends her time in plain suing and such deeds of charity, as one with small means but willing heart can find the opportunity of doing in a town like this. But why, in the name of wonders, do you ask?" "Business," said I. "Business. Mrs. Belden, don't mention it by the way, has got mixed up in a case of mine, and I felt it due to my curiosity, if not to my purse, to find out something about her. And I am not satisfied yet. The fact is I would give something, Monell, for the opportunity of studying this woman's character. Now couldn't you manage to get me introduced into her house in some way that would make it possible and proper for me to converse with her at my leisure? Business would thank you if you could." "Well, I don't know. I suppose it could be done. She used to take lodgers in the summer when the hotel was full, and might be induced to give a bed to a friend of mine who is very anxious to be near the post office on account of a business telegram he is expecting, and which when it comes will demand his immediate attention. And Missy—" Monell gave me a sly wink of his eye, little imagining how near the mark he had struck. "You need not say that. Tell her I have a peculiar dislike to sleeping in a public house, and that you know of no one better fitted to accommodate me for the short time I desire to be in town than Herselthoff, and what will be said of my hospitality in allowing you under these circumstances to remain in any other house than my own. I don't know, very hard things, no doubt, but I guess your hospitality can stand it. Well, if you persist, we will see what can be done. And driving up to a neat white cottage of homely, but sufficiently attractive appearance, he stopped. This is her house, said he, jumping to the ground. Let's go in and see what we can do. Glancing up at the windows, which were all closed save the two on the veranda overlooking the street, I thought to myself, if she has anybody in hiding here, whose presence in the house she desires to keep secret, it is folly to hope she will take me in, however well recommended I may come. But, yielding to the example of my friend, I alighted in my turn and followed him up the short, grass-bordered walk to the front door. As she has no servant, she will come to the door herself, so be ready, he remarked as he knocked. I had barely time to observe that the curtains to the window at my left suddenly dropped, when a hasty step made itself heard within, and a quick hand drew open the door, and I saw before me the woman whom I had observed at the post office, and whose action with the letters had struck me as peculiar. I recognized her at first glance, though she was differently dressed, and had evidently passed through some worry or excitement that had altered the expression of her countenance, and made her manner what it was not at that time, strained and a trifle uncertain. But I saw no reason for thinking she remembered me. On the contrary, the look she directed towards me had nothing but inquiry in it, and when Mr. Mannell pushed me forward with the remark, "A friend of mine, in fact my lawyer from New York," she dropped a hurried old-fashioned curtsy, whose only expression was a manifest desire to appear sensible of the honor conferred upon her, through the mist of a certain trouble that confused everything about her. "We have come to ask a favor, Mrs. Belden, but may we not come in?" said my client in a round, hearty voice well calculated to recall a person's thoughts into their proper channel. "I have heard many times of your cosy home, and am glad of this opportunity of seeing it." And with a blind disregard to the look of surprised resistance with which she met his advance, he stepped gallantly into the little room whose cheery red carpet and bright picture-hung walls showed invitingly through the half-open door at our left. Finding her premises thus invaded by a sort of French cup d'etat, Mrs. Belden made the best of the situation, and pressing me to enter also, devoted herself to hospitality. As for Mr. Mannell, he quite blossomed out in his endeavors to make himself agreeable, so much so that I shortly found myself laughing at his sallies, though my heart was full of anxiety lest, after all, our efforts should fail of the success they certainly merited. Meanwhile, Mrs. Belden softened more and more, joining in the conversation with an ease hardly to be expected from one in her humble circumstances. Indeed, I soon saw she was no common woman. There was a refinement in her speech and manner, which, combined with her motherly presence and gentle air, was very pleasing. The last woman in the world to suspect of any underhanded proceeding, if she had not shown a peculiar hesitation when Mr. Mannell broached the subject of my entertainment there. "I don't know, sir. I would be glad, but—" and she turned a very scrutinizing look upon me. "The fact is, I have not taken lodgers of late, and I have got out of the way of the whole thing, and am afraid I cannot make him comfortable. In short, you will have to excuse me." "But we can't," returned Mr. Mannell. "What? Entice a fellow into a room like this," and he cast a hearty, admiring glance round the apartment which, for all its simplicity, both its warm colouring and general air of cosiness amply merited, and then turn a cold shoulder upon him, when he humbly entreats the honour of staying a single night in the enjoyment of its attractions. "No, Mrs. Belden, I know you too well for that. Lazarus himself couldn't come to your door and be turned away, much less a good-hearted, clever-headed young gentleman like my friend here. "You are very good," she began, an almost weak love of praise showing itself for a moment in her eyes. "But I have no room prepared. I have been house-cleaning, and everything is topsy-turvy, Mrs. Wright, now. Over the way." "My young friend is going to stop here," Mr. Mell broke in with frank positiveness. "If I cannot have him at my own house, and for certain reasons it is not advisable, I shall at least have the satisfaction of knowing he is in the charge of the best housekeeper in R. Wes," I put in, but without too great a show of interest. I should be sorry, once introduced here, to be obliged to go elsewhere. The troubled eye wavered away from us to the door. "I was never called inhospitable," she commenced, "but everything in such disorder. What time would you like to come?" "I was in hopes I might remain now," I replied. "I have some letters to write, and ask nothing better than for leave to sit here and write them." At the word letters I saw her hand go to her pocket in a movement which must have been involuntary, for her countenance did not change, and she made the quick reply, "Well, you may. If you can put up with such poor accommodations as I can offer, shall not be said I refused you what Mr. Monell is pleased to call a favour." And, complete in her reception as she had been in her resistance, she gave us a pleasant smile, and, ignoring my thanks, bustled out with Mr. Monell to the buggy, where she received my bag and what was, doubtless, more to her taste, the compliments he was now more than ever ready to bestow upon her. "I will see that a room is got ready for you in a very short space of time," she said upon re-entering. "Meanwhile, make yourself at home here, and if you wish to write, why, I think you will find everything for the purpose in these drawers." And wheeling up a table to the easy chair in which I sat, she pointed to the small compartments beneath, with an air of such manifest desire to have me make use of anything, and everything she had, that I found myself wondering over my position with a sort of startled embarrassment that was not remote from shame. "Thank you, I have materials of my own," said I, and hastened to open my bag and bring out the writing case, which I always carried with me. "Then I will leave you," said she, and with a quick bend and a short, hurried look out of the window, she hastily quitted the room. I could hear her steps cross the hall, go up 2 or 3 stairs, pause, go up the rest of the flight, pause again, and then pass on. I was left on the first floor alone, 28. A weird experience. Flat burglary as ever was committed. Much ado about nothing. The first thing I did was to inspect with greater care the room in which I sat. It was a pleasant apartment, as I have already said, squenny and well furnished. On the floor was a crimson carpet. On the walls several pictures, at the windows cheerful curtains of white, tastefully ornamented with ferns and autumn leaves. In one corner an old melodeon, and in the centre of the room a table draped with a bright cloth, on which were various little knick-knacks which, without being rich or expensive, were both pretty and, to a certain extent, ornamental. But it was not these things, which I had seen repeated in many other country homes, that especially attracted my attention, or drew me forward in the slow march which I now undertook around the room. It was the something underlying all these, the evidences which I found, or sought to find, not only in the general aspect of the room, but in each trivial object I encountered, of the character, disposition, and history of the woman with whom I now had to deal. It was for this reason I studied the daguerreotypes on the mantelpiece, the books on the shelf, and the music on the rack. For this, and the still further purpose of noting if any indications were to be found of there being in the house any such person as Hannah. First, then, for the little library, which I was pleased to see occupied one corner of the room, composed of a few well-chosen books, poetical, historical, and narrative. It was of itself sufficient to account for the evidences of latent culture observable in Mrs. Belden's conversation. Taking out a well-worn copy of Byron, I opened it. There were many passages marked, and replacing the book with a mental comment upon her evident impressibility to the softer emotions. I turned towards the melodeon fronting me from the opposite wall. It was closed, but on its neatly covered top lay 1 or 2 hymn books, a basket of russet apples, and a piece of half-completed knitting work. I took up the latter, but was forced to lay it down again without a notion for what it was intended. Proceeding, I next stopped before a window opening upon the small yard that ran about the house, and separated it from the one adjoining. The scene without failed to attract me, but the window itself drew my attention, for written with a diamond point on one of the panes, I perceived a row of letters which, as nearly as I could make out, were meant for some word or words, but which utterly failed in sense or apparent connection. Passing it by as the work of some schoolgirl, I glanced down at the work-basket standing on a table at my side. It was full of various kinds of work, among which I spied a pair of stockings, which were much too small, as well as in too great a state of disrepair, to belong to Mrs. Belden, and drawing them carefully out, I examined them for any name on them. Do not start when I say I saw the letter H plainly marked upon them. Thrusting them back, I drew a deep breath of relief, gazing, as I did so, out of the window when those letters again attracted my attention. Succursive letters, what could they mean? Idly I began to read them backward when— But try for yourself, reader, and judge of my surprise. Elate at the discovery thus made, I sat down to write my letters. I had barely finished them, when Mrs. Belden came in with the announcement that supper was ready. "As for your room," said she, "have prepared my own room for your use, thinking you would like to remain on the first floor." And, throwing open a door at my side, she displayed a small but comfortable room, in which I could dimly see a bed, an immense bureau, and a shadowy looking-glass in a dark, old-fashioned frame. "I live in very primitive fashion," she resumed, leading the way into the dining-room. "But I mean to be comfortable and make others so." "I should say you amply succeeded," I rejoined, with an appreciative glance at her well-spread board. She smiled, and I felt I had paved the way to her good graces in a way that would yet redound to my advantage. Shall I ever forget that supper, its dainties, its pleasant freedom, its mysterious, pervading atmosphere of unreality, and the constant sense which every bountiful dish she pressed upon me brought of the shame of eating this woman's food, with such feelings of suspicion in my heart? Shall I ever forget the emotion I experienced when I first perceived she had something on her mind, which she longed, yet hesitated, to give utterance to? Or how she started when a cat jumped from the sloping roof of the kitchen onto the grass plot at the back of the house? Or how my heart throbbed when I heard, or thought I heard, a board creak overhead? We were in a long and narrow room which seemed, curiously enough, to run crosswise of the house, opening on one side into the parlour, and on the other into the small bedroom which had been allotted to my use. "You live in this house alone, without fear?" I asked as Mrs. Belden, contrary to my desire, put another bit of cold chicken on my plate. "Have you no marauders in this town, no tramps, of whom a solitary woman like you might reasonably be afraid?" "No one will hurt me," said she. "And no one ever came here for food or shelter but got it?" "Should think, then, that living as you do, upon a railroad, you would be constantly overrun with worthless beings whose only trade is to take all they can get without giving a return. I cannot turn them away. It is the only luxury I have, to feed the poor. But the idle, restless ones, who neither will work nor let others work, still the poor," mentally remarking, "Here is the woman to shield an unfortunate who has somehow become entangled in the meshes of a great crime." I drew back from the table. As I did so, the thought crossed me that, in case there was any such person in the house as Hannah, she would take the opportunity of going upstairs with something for her to eat, and that she might not feel hampered by my presence, I stepped out on the veranda with my cigar. While smoking it, I looked about for Q. I felt that the least token of his presence in town would be very encouraging at this time. But it seemed I was not to be afforded even that small satisfaction. If Q was anywhere near, he was lying very low. Once again seated with Mrs. Belden, who I know came downstairs with an empty plate, for going into the kitchen for a drink, I caught her in the act of setting it down on the table. I made up my mind to wait a reasonable length of time for what she had to say, and then, if she did not speak, make an endeavour on my own part to surprise her secret. But her avowal was nearer and of a different nature from what I expected, and brought its own train of consequences with it. "You are a lawyer, I believe," she began, taking down her knitting work with a forced display of industry. "Wes," I said, "that is my profession." She remained for a moment silent, creating great havoc in her work, I am sure, from the glance of surprise and vexation she afterwards threw it. Then, in a hesitating voice, "Remark it, perhaps you may be willing, then, to give me some advice. The truth is, I am in a very curious predicament, one from which I don't know how to escape, and yet which demands immediate action. I should like to tell you about it. May I?" "You may. I shall be only too happy to give you any advice in my power." She drew in her breath with a sort of vague relief, though her forehead did not lose its frown. "It can all be said in a few words. I have in my possession a package of papers which were entrusted to me by two ladies, with the understanding that I should neither return nor destroy them without the full cognizance and express desire of both parties, given in person or writing. That they were to remain in my hands till then, and that nothing or nobody should extort them from me." "That is easily understood," said I, for she stopped. "But now comes word from one of the ladies, the one, too, most interested in the matter, that, for certain reasons, the immediate destruction of those papers is necessary to her peace and safety. And do you want to know what your duty is in this case?" "Wes!" she tremulously replied. I rose. I could not help it, a flood of conjectures rushing in tumult over me. "It is to hold on to the papers like grim death till released from your guardianship by the combined wish of both parties. Is that your opinion as a lawyer?" "Wes, and as a man, once pledged in that way, you have no choice. It would be a betrayal of trust to yield to the solicitations of one party what you have undertaken to return to both. The fact that grief or loss might follow your retention of these papers does not release you from your bond. You have nothing to do with that. Besides, you are by no means sure that the representations of the so-called interested party are true. You might be doing a greater wrong by destroying in this way what is manifestly considered of value to them both than by preserving the papers intact according to compact. But the circumstances alter cases, and in short, it seems to me that the wishes of the one most interested ought to be regarded, especially as there is an estrangement between these ladies which may hinder the other's consent from ever being obtained." "No," said I, "two wrongs never make a right, nor are we at liberty to do an act of justice at the expense of an injustice. The papers must be preserved, Mrs. Belden." Her head sank very despondingly. Evidently it had been her wish to please the interested party. "Law is very hard," she said, "very hard. This is not only law, but plain duty," I remarked. "Suppose a case different. Suppose the honour and happiness of the other party depended upon the preservation of the papers, where would your duty be then?" "But—" "A contract is a contract," said I, "and cannot be tampered with. Having accepted the trust and given your word, you are obliged to fulfill, to the letter, all its conditions. It would be a breach of trust for you to return or destroy the papers without the mutual consent necessary." An expression of great gloom settled slowly over her features. "I suppose you are right," said she, and became silent. Watching her, I thought to myself, if I were Mr. Gryce, or even Q, I would never leave this seat till I had probed this matter to the bottom, learned the names of the parties concerned, and where those precious papers are hidden, which she declares to be of so much importance. But being neither, I could only keep her talking upon the subject until she should let fall some word that might serve as a guide to my further enlightenment. I therefore turned, with the intention of asking her some question, when my attention was attracted by the figure of a woman coming out of the back door of the neighboring house, who, for general dilapidation and uncouthnesss of bearing, was a perfect type of the style of tramp of whom we had been talking at the supper table. Knowing a crust which she threw away as she reached the street, she trudged down the path, her scanty dress, piteous in its rags and soil, flapping in the keen spring wind, and revealing ragged shoes red with the mud of the highway. "There is a customer that may interest you," said I. Mrs. Belden seemed to awake from a trance. Rising slowly, she looked out, and with a rapidly softening gaze surveyed the forlorn creature before her. "Poor thing," she muttered, "but I cannot do much for her tonight. A good supper is all I can give her." And, going to the front door, she bade her step round the house to the kitchen, where, in another moment, I heard the rough creature's voice rise in one long "Bless you," that could only have been produced by the setting before her of the good things with which Mrs. Belden's larder seemed teeming. But supper was not all she wanted. After a decent length of time, employed as I should judge in mastication, I heard her voice rise once more in a plea for shelter. "The barn, ma'am, or the wood-house, any place where I can lie out of the wind." And she commenced a long tale of want and disease, so piteous to hear that I was not at all surprised when Mrs. Belden told me, upon re-entering, that she had consented, notwithstanding her previous determination, to allow the woman to lie before the kitchen fire for the night. "She has such an honest eye," said she, "and charity is my only luxury." The interruption of this incident effectually broke up our conversation. Mrs. Belden went upstairs, and for some time I was left alone to ponder over what I had heard, and determine upon my future course of action. I had just reached the conclusion that she would be fully as liable to be carried away by her feelings to the destruction of the papers in her charge, as to be governed by the rules of equity I had laid down to her, when I heard her stealthily descend the stairs and go out by the front door. Distrustful of her intentions, I took up my hat and hastily followed her. She was on her way down the main street, and my first thought was that she was bound for some neighbour's house, or perhaps for the hotel itself. But the settled swing into which she soon altered her restless pace satisfied me that she had some distant goal in prospect, and before long I found myself passing the hotel with its appurtenances, even the little schoolhouse. That was the last building at this end of the village, and stepping out into the country beyond. What could it mean? But still her fluttering figure hasted on, the outlines of her form, with its close shawl and neat bonnet, growing fainter and fainter in the now settled darkness of an April night, and still I followed, walking on the turf at the side of the road lest she should hear my footsteps and look round. At last we reached a bridge. Over this I could hear her pass, and then every sound ceased. She had paused, and was evidently listening. It would not do for me to pause too, so gathering myself into as awkward a shape as possible, I sauntered by her down the road, but arrived at a certain point, stopped, and began retracing my steps with a sharp lookout for her advancing figure till I had arrived once more at the bridge. She was not there. Convinced now that she had discovered my motive for being in her house, and, by leading me from it, had undertaken to supply Hannah with an opportunity for escape. I was about to hasten back to the charge I had so incautiously left, when a strange sound heard at my left arrested me. It came from the banks of the puny stream which ran under the bridge, and was like the creaking of an old door on worn-out hinges. Leaping the fence, I made my way as best I could down the sloping field in the direction from which the sound came. It was quite dark, and my progress was slow, so much so that I began to fear I had ventured upon a wild goose chase. When an unexpected streak of lightning shot across the sky, and by its glare I saw before me what seemed, in the momentary glimpse I had of it, an old barn. From the rush of waters near at hand, I judged it to be somewhere on the edge of the stream, and consequently hesitated to advance, when I heard the sound of heavy breathing near me, followed by a stir as of someone feeling his way over a pile of loose boards. And presently, while I stood there, a faint blue light flashed up from the interior of the barn, and I saw, through the tumbled-down door that faced me, the form of Mrs. Belden standing with a lighted match in her hand, gazing round on the four walls that encompassed her. Hardly daring to breathe, lest I should alarm her, I watched her while she turned and peered at the roof above her, which was so old as to be more than half open to the sky, at the flooring beneath, which was in a state of equal dilapidation, and finally at a small tin box, which she drew from under her shawl and laid on the ground at her feet. The sight of that box at once satisfied me as to the nature of her errand. She was going to hide what she dared not destroy, and, relieved upon this point, I was about to take a step forward when the match went out in her hand. While she was engaged in lighting another, I considered that perhaps it would be better for me not to arouse her apprehensions by accosting her at this time, and thus endanger the success of my main scheme, but to wait till she was gone, before I endeavoured to secure the box. Accordingly, I edged my way up to the side of the barn, and waited till she should leave it, knowing that if I attempted to peer in at the door, I ran great risk of being seen, owing to the frequent streaks of lightning which now flashed about us on every side. Minute after minute went by, with its weird alternations of heavy darkness and sudden glare, and still she did not come. At last, just as I was about to start impatiently from my hiding-place, she reappeared and began to withdraw with faltering steps toward the bridge. When I thought her quite out of hearing, I stole from my retreat and entered the barn. It was of course as dark as Erebus, but thanks to being a smoker I was as well provided with matches as she had been, and having struck one, I held it up, but the light it gave was very feeble, and as I did not know just where to look, it went out before I had obtained more than a cursory glimpse of the spot where I was. I thereupon lit another, but though I confined my attention to one place, namely, the floor at my feet, it too went out before I could conjecture by means of any sign seen there where she had hidden the box. I now for the first time realized the difficulty before me. She had probably made up her mind, before she left home, in just what portion of this old barn she would conceal her treasure, but I had nothing to guide me. I could only waste matches, and I did waste them. A dozen had been lit and extinguished before I was so much as sure the box was not under a pile of debris that lay in one corner, and I had taken the last in my hand before I became aware that one of the broken boards of the floor was pushed a little out of its proper position. One match, and that board was to be raised, the space beneath examined, and the box, if there, lifted safely out. I concluded not to waste my resources, so kneeling down in the darkness, I groped for the board, tried it, and found it to be loose. Wrenching at it with all my strength, I tore it free and cast it aside, then lighting my match looked into the hole thus made. Something, I could not tell what stone or box, met my eye, but while I reached for it, the match flew out of my hand. Deploring my carelessness, but determined at all hazards to secure what I had seen, I delved down deep into the hole, and in another moment had the object of my curiosity in my hands. It was the box. Satisfied at this result of my efforts, I turned to depart, my one wish now being to arrive home before Mrs. Belden. Was this possible? She had several minutes the start of me. I would have to pass her on the road, and in so doing might be recognized. Was the end worth the risk? I decided that it was. Regaining the highway, I started at a brisk pace. For some little distance I kept it up, neither overtaking nor meeting anyone. But suddenly, at a turn in the road, I came unexpectedly upon Mrs. Belden, standing in the middle of the path, looking back. Somewhat disconcerted, I hastened swiftly by her, expecting her to make some effort to stop me. But she let me pass without a word. Indeed, I doubt now if she even saw or heard me. Astonished at this treatment, and still more surprised that she made no attempt to follow me, I looked back, when I saw what enchained her to the spot, and made her so unmindful of my presence. The barn behind us was on fire. Instantly I realized it was the work of my hands. I had dropped a half-extinguished match, and it had fallen upon some inflammable substance. Aghast at the sight, I paused in my turn, and stood staring. Higher and higher the red flames mounted, brighter and brighter glowed the clouds above, the stream beneath, and in the fascination of watching it all, I forgot Mrs. Belden. But a short, agitated gasp in my vicinity soon recalled her presence to my mind, and drawing nearer, I heard her exclaim like a person speaking in a dream, "Well, I didn't mean to do it." Then lower, and with a certain satisfaction in her tone, "But it's all right anyway. The thing is lost now for good, and Mary will be satisfied without any one being to blame." I did not linger to hear more. If this was the conclusion she had come to, she would not wait there long, especially as the sound of distant shouts and running feet announced that a crowd of village boys was on its way to the scene of the conflagration. The first thing I did, upon my arrival at the house, was to assure myself that no evil effects had followed my inconsiderate desertion of it to the mercies of the tramp she had taken in, the next to retire to my room and take a peep at the box. I found it to be a neat-in coffer, fastened with a lock. Satisfied from its weight that it contained nothing heavier than the papers of which Mrs. Belden had spoken, I hid it under the bed and returned to the sitting-room. I had barely taken a seat and lifted a book when Mrs. Belden came in. "Well," cried she, taking off her bonnet and revealing a face much flushed with exercise, but greatly relieved in expression, "this is a night. It lightens, and there is a fire somewhere down street, and altogether it is perfectly dreadful out. I hope you have not been lonesome," she continued, with a keen searching of my face which I bore in the best way I could. "I had an errand to attend to, but didn't expect to stay so long." I returned some nonchalant reply, and she hastened from the room to fasten up the house. I waited, but she did not come back, fearful, perhaps, of betraying herself. She had retired to her own apartment, leaving me to take care of myself as best I might. I own that I was rather relieved at this. The fact is, I did not feel equal to any more excitement that night, and was glad to put off further action until the next day. As soon then as the storm was over, I myself went to bed, and after several ineffectual efforts, succeeded in getting asleep. 29. The missing witness. I fled and cried out death. Milton. Mr. Raymond. The voice was low and searching. It reached me in my dreams, waked me, and caused me to look up. Morning had begun to break, and by its light I saw, standing in the open door leading into the dining-room, the forlorn figure of the tramp who had been admitted into the house the night before. Angry and perplexed, I was about to bid her begone, when, to my great surprise, she pulled out a red handkerchief from her pocket, and I recognized Q. "Read that?" said he, hastily advancing and putting a slip of paper into my hand, and, without another word or look, left the room, closing the door behind him. Rising in considerable agitation, I took it to the window, and by the rapidly increasing light succeeded in making out the rudely scrawled lines as follows: "Shishi is here. I have seen her," in the room marked with a cross in the accompanying plan. "Wait till 8 o'clock, then go up. I will contrive some means of getting Mrs. B. out of the house." Sketched below this was the following plan of the upper floor. The upper floor plan, Hannah, then, was in the small back room over the dining-room, and I had not been deceived in thinking I had heard steps overhead the evening before. Greatly relieved, and yet at the same time much moved at the near prospect of being brought face to face with one who we had every reason to believe was acquainted with the dreadful secret involved in the Leavenworth murder. I lay down once more and endeavoured to catch another hour's rest, but I soon gave up the effort in despair, and contented myself with listening to the sounds of awakening life, which now began to make themselves heard in the house and neighbourhood. As Q had closed the door after him, I could only faintly hear Mrs. Belden when she came downstairs, but the short, surprised exclamation which she uttered upon reaching the kitchen and finding the tramp gone, and the back door wide open, came plainly enough to my ears, and for a moment I was not sure but that Q had made a mistake in thus leaving so unceremoniously. But he had not studied Mrs. Belden's character in vain. As she came, in the course of her preparations for breakfast, into the room adjoining mine, I could hear her murmur to herself, "Poor thing! She has lived so long in the fields and at the roadside. She finds it unnatural to be cooped up in the house all night." The trial of that breakfast, the effort to eat and appear unconcerned, to chat and make no mistake. May I never be called upon to go through such another. But at last it was over, and I was left free to await in my own room the time for the dreaded though much to be desired interview. Slowly the minutes passed. 8 o'clock struck, when just as the last vibration ceased, there came a loud knock at the back door, and a little boy burst into the kitchen, crying at the top of his voice, "Papa's got a fit! Oh, Mrs. Belden, Papa's got a fit, do come!" Rising, as was natural, I hastened towards the kitchen, meeting Mrs. Belden's anxious face in the doorway. "A poor wood chopper down the street has fallen in a fit," she said. "Will you please watch over the house while I see what I can do for him? I won't be absent any longer than I can help." And almost without waiting for my reply, she caught up a shawl, threw it over her head, and followed the urchin, who was in a state of great excitement, out into the street. Instantly the silence of death seemed to fill the house, and a dread the greatest I had ever experienced settled upon me. To leave the kitchen, go up those stairs, and confront that girl seemed for the moment beyond my power, but once on the stair I found myself relieved from the especial dread which had overwhelmed me, and possessed, instead, of a sort of combative curiosity that led me to throw open the door which I saw at the top with a certain fierceness new to my nature, and not altogether suitable, perhaps, to the occasion. I found myself in a large bedroom, evidently the one occupied by Mrs. Belden the night before. Barely stopping to note certain evidences of her having passed a restless night, I passed on to the door leading into the room marked with a cross in the plan drawn for me by Q. It was a rough affair, made of pine boards rudely painted. Pausing before it, I listened. All was still. Raising the latch, I endeavoured to enter. The door was locked. Pausing again, I bent my ear to the keyhole. Not a sound came from within. The grave itself could not have been stiller, or struck and irresolute. I looked about me and questioned what I had best do. Suddenly I remembered that, in the plan Q had given me, I had seen intimation of another door leading into this same room from the one on the opposite side of the hall. Going hastily around to it, I tried it with my hand, but it was as fast as the other. Convinced at last that nothing was left me but force, I spoke for the first time, and, calling the girl by name, commanded her to open the door. Receiving no response, I said aloud with an accent of severity, "Hannah Chester, you are discovered. If you do not open the door, we shall be obliged to break it down. Save us the trouble, then, and open immediately." Still no reply. Going back a step, I threw my whole weight against the door. It creaked ominously, but still resisted. I could not prevent a feeling of sickly apprehension from seizing me as I turned towards the silent figure stretched so near, stopping only long enough to be sure no movement had taken place within. I pressed against it once more, this time with all my strength, when it flew from its hinges, and I fell forward into a room so stifling, chill, and dark that I paused for a moment to collect my scattered senses before venturing to look around me. It was well I did so. In another moment, The pallor and fixity of the pretty Irish face staring upon me from amidst the tumbled clothes of a bed, drawn up against the wall at my side, struck me with so death-like a chill that, had it not been for that one instant of preparation, I should have been seriously dismayed. As it was, I could not prevent a feeling of sickly apprehension from seizing me as I turned towards the silent figure stretched so near, and observed with what marble-like repose it lay beneath the patchwork, quilt drawn across it, asking myself if sleep could be indeed so like death in its appearance. For that it was a sleeping woman I beheld, I did not seriously doubt. There were too many evidences of careless life in the room for any other inference. The clothes, left just as she had stepped from them in a circle on the floor, the liberal plate of food placed in waiting for her on the chair by the door. Food amongst which I recognized, even in this casual glance, the same dish which we had had for breakfast. All and everything in the room spoke of robust life and reckless belief in the morrow, and yet so white was the brow turned up to the bare beams of the unfinished wall above her, so glassy the look of the half-opened eyes, so motionless the arm lying half under, half over, the edge of the coverlid, that it was impossible not to shrink from contact with a creature so sunk in unconsciousness. But contact seemed to be necessary. Any cry which I could raise at that moment would be ineffectual enough to pierce those dull ears. Nerving myself, therefore, I stooped and lifted the hand which lay with its telltale scar mockingly uppermost, intending to speak call, do something, anything, to arouse her. But at the first touch of her hand on mine an unspeakable horror thrilled me. It was not only icy cold, but stiff. Dropping it in my agitation, I started back and again surveyed the face. Great God, when did life ever look like that? What sleep ever wore such pallid hues, such accusing fixedness? Bending once more, I listened at the lips. Not a breath, nor a stir. Shocked to the core of my being, I made one final effort. Tearing down the clothes, I laid my hand upon her heart. It was pulseless as stone, 30, burned paper. I could have better spared a better man. Henry IV. I do not think I called immediately for help. The awful shock of this discovery, coming as it did at the very moment life and hope were strongest within me, the sudden downfall which it brought of all the plans based upon this woman's expected testimony, and worst of all, the dread coincidence between this sudden death and the exigency in which the guilty party, whoever it was supposed to be at that hour, were much too appalling for instant action. I could only stand and stare at the quiet face before me, smiling in its peaceful rest, as if death were pleasanter than we think, and marvel over the providence which had brought us renewed fear instead of relief, complication instead of enlightenment, disappointment instead of realization. For eloquent as is death, even on the faces of those unknown and unloved by us, the causes and consequences of this one were much too important to allow the mind to dwell upon the pathos of the scene itself. Hannah the girl was lost in Hannah the witness. But gradually, as I gazed, the look of expectation which I perceived hovering about the wistful mouth and half-open lids attracted me, and I bent above her with a more personal interest, asking myself if she were quite dead, and whether not immediate medical assistance would be of any avail. But the more closely I looked, the more certain I became that she had been dead for some hours, and the dismay occasioned by this thought, taken with the regrets which I must ever feel, that I had not adopted the bold course the evening before, and, by forcing my way to the hiding place of this poor creature, interrupted, if not prevented, the consummation of her fate, startled me into a realization of my present situation, and, leaving her side, I went into the next room, threw up the window, and fastened to the blind the red handkerchief which I had taken the precaution to bring with me. Instantly a young man, whom I was fain to believe Q, though he bore not the least resemblance, either in dress or facial expression, to any renderings of that youth which I had yet seen, emerged from the tinsmith's house, and approached the one I was in. Observing him cast a hurried glance in my direction, I crossed the floor and stood awaiting him at the head of the stairs. Well, he whispered, upon entering the house and meeting my glance from below, "Have you seen her?" "Yes." I returned bitterly, "I have seen her." He hurriedly mounted to my side, "And she has confessed." "No, I have had no talk with her." Then, as I perceived him growing alarmed at my voice and manner, I drew him into Mrs. Belden's room and hastily inquired, "What did you mean this morning when you informed me you had seen this girl? That she was in a certain room where I might find her?" "What?" I said. "You have, then, been to her room?" "I crawled up onto the ledge of the slanting roof last night." "And saw her moving round the room?" "No, I've only been on the outside of it." "Seeing a light?" "I crawled up onto the ledge of the slanting roof last night, while both you and Mrs. Belden were out, and, looking through the window, saw her moving round the room." He must have observed my countenance change, for he stopped. "What is to pay?" he cried. I could restrain myself no longer. "Come," I said, "and see for yourself." And, leading him to the little room I had just left, I pointed to the silent form lying within. "You told me I should find Hannah here, but you did not tell me I should find her in this condition." "Oh, great heaven!" he cried with a start. "Not dead?" "Wes," I said. "Dead." It seemed as if he could not realize it. "But it is impossible," he returned. "She is in a heavy sleep, has taken a narcotic." "It is not sleep," I said, "for if it is, she will never wake. Look," and, taking the hand once more in mine, I let it fall in its stone weight upon the bed. The sight seemed to convince him. Calming down, he stood gazing at her with a very strange expression upon his face. Suddenly he moved, and began quietly turning over the clothes that were lying on the floor. "What are you doing?" I asked. "What are you looking for?" "I am looking for the bit of paper from which I saw her take what I supposed to be a dose of medicine last night." "Oh, here it is," he cried, lifting a morsel of paper that, lying on the floor under the edge of the bed, had hitherto escaped his notice. "Let me see," I anxiously exclaimed. He handed me the paper, on the inner surface of which I could dimly discern the traces of an impalpable white powder. "This is important," I declared, carefully folding the paper together. "If there is enough of this powder remaining to show that the contents of this paper were poisonous, the manner and means of the girl's death are accounted for, and a case of deliberate suicide made evident." "I am not so sure of that," he retorted. "If I am any judge of countenances, and I rather flatter myself I am, this girl had no more idea she was taking poison than I had. She looked not only bright but gay, and when she tipped up the paper, a smile of almost silly triumph crossed her face. If Mrs. Belden gave her that dose to take, telling her it was medicine. That is something which yet remains to be learned, also whether the dose, as you call it, was poisonous or not. It may be she died of heart disease." He simply shrugged his shoulders and pointed first at the plate of breakfast left on the chair, and secondly at the broken-down door. "Yes," I said, answering his look. "Miss Belden has been in here this morning, and Mrs. Belden locked the door when she went out. But that proves nothing beyond her belief in the girl's hearty condition. A belief which that white face on its tumbled pillow did not seem to shake. Perhaps in her haste she may not have looked at the girl, but have set the dishes down without more than a casual glance in her direction. I don't want to suspect anything wrong, but it is such a coincidence. This was touching me on a sore point, and I stepped back. "Well," said I, "there is no use in our standing here busying ourselves with conjectures. There is too much to be done. Come," and I moved hurriedly towards the door. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Have you forgotten this is but an episode in the one great mystery we are sent here to unravel? If this girl has come to her death by some foul play, it is our business to find it out, but that must be left for the coroner. It has now passed out of our hands. I know, but we can at least take full note of the room and everything in it before throwing the affair into the hands of strangers. Mr. Gryce will expect that much of us, I am sure. I have looked at the room. The whole is photographed on my mind. I am only afraid I can never forget it. And the body? Have you noticed its position? The lay of the bedclothes around it, the lack there is of all signs of struggle or fear, the repose of the countenance, the easy fall of the hands. Yes, yes. Don't make me look it any more, Gore. Then the clothes hanging on the wall, rapidly pointing out each object as he spoke. Do you see? A calico dress, a shawl. Not the one in which she was believed to have run away, but an old black one, probably belonging to Mrs. Belden. Then this chest, opening it, containing a few underclothes marked. Let us see, with the name of the lady of the house, but smaller than any she ever wore, made for Hannah, you observe, and marked with her own name to prevent suspicion. And then these other clothes lying on the floor, all new, all marked in the same way. Then this. Halloo! Look here, he suddenly cried. Going over to where he stood, I stooped down, when a washbowl half full of burned paper met my eye. I saw her bending over something in this corner, and could not think what it was. Can it be she is a suicide, after all? She has evidently destroyed something here which she didn't wish anyone to see. I do not know, I said. I could almost hope so. Not a scrap, not a morsel left to show what it was. How unfortunate. Mrs. Belden must solve this riddle, I cried. Mrs. Belden must solve the whole riddle, he replied. The secret of the Leavenworth murder hangs upon it. Then, with a lingering look towards the mass of burned paper, who knows but what that was a confession? The conjecture seemed only too probable. Whatever it was, said I, it is now ashes, and we have got to accept the fact and make the best of it. Yes, said he with a deep sigh. That's so, but Mr. Gryce will never forgive me for it. Never. He will say I ought to have known it was a suspicious circumstance for her to take a dose of medicine at the very moment detection stood at her back. But she did not know that. She did not see you. We don't know what she saw, nor what Mrs. Belden saw. Women are a mystery, and though I flatter myself that ordinarily I am a match for the keenest bit of female flesh that ever walked, I must say that in this case I feel myself thoroughly and shamefully worsted. Well, well, I said, the end has not come yet. Who knows what a talk with Mrs. Belden will bring out? And, by the way, she will be coming back soon, and I must be ready to meet her. Everything depends upon finding out, if I can, whether she is aware of this tragedy or not. It is just possible she knows nothing about it. And, hurrying him from the room, I pulled the door to behind me, and led the way downstairs. "Now," said I, "there is one thing you must attend to at once. A telegram must be sent, Mrs. Gryce acquainting him with this unlooked-for occurrence." "All right, sir," and Q started for the door. "Wait one moment," said I. "I may not have another opportunity to mention it. Mrs. Belden received 2 letters from the postmaster yesterday, one in a large and one in a small envelope. If you could find out where they were postmarked." Q put his hand in his pocket. "I think I will not have to go far to find out where one of them came from. Good George, I have lost it." And before I knew it, he had returned upstairs. That moment I heard the gate click,